Some marriages end in divorce, others end in exposure. This one did not end at all. It simply stopped moving. Two people lived under the same roof, shared the same legal name, and slept behind the same locked doors, but they no longer shared a life. What they shared was something else entirely, an agreement that was never spoken, a truce that could not be written down, a silence that had rules. Smash the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and tell me in the comments section where you are watching from. Let's dive in. There were no raised voices in this house, no slammed doors, no dramatic confrontations, because noise attracts attention, and attention is dangerous. This was not a marriage held together by love. It was held together by knowledge. Each of them knew something that could erase the other. To the outside world, they were ordinary, respectable, quiet, the kind of couple neighbors barely noticed, the kind of marriage that looked settled, stable, finished with excitement, but secure in routine. But inside the house, every word was measured, every glance was accounted for, every moment was calculated. They did not ask each other questions anymore. Questions invite answers. Answers create records. Instead, they observed. The husband moved through the house with precision. His routines were consistent. His tone was calm. His public life was polished. Career, reputation, professional standing. A man who had built a future carefully, brick by brick, document by document. Documents that were never supposed to be examined too closely. A framed certificate hung in his office, clean, official, impressive. It had opened doors that would otherwise remain locked. It had granted him authority, income, and trust. It had also built his entire life on paper that did not belong to him. The wife knew this. She had known for years. She never confronted him. There was no need, because he knew something too. She carried herself with control, organized, methodical. Her movements suggested order, discipline, and calm. She kept records. She believed in documentation. She believed in backups. And somewhere beyond the walls of the house, behind reinforced doors, numbered keys, and regulated access, proof of her actions existed. Not rumors, not suspicions, evidence. It rested in a place designed for permanence, a place where silence is enforced and time moves slowly, a place where what is stored is meant to outlive excuses. The husband knew where it was. He did not need to see it. Knowing it existed was enough. This is how the marriage survived, not through affection, not through forgiveness, but through restraint. They understood the balance perfectly. If he tried to leave, questions would be asked. If she agreed to separate, systems would activate. Lawyers, institutions, records, verifications, processes that neither of them could survive. So they stayed, not together, but contained. Their conversations were practical, neutral, domestic. They discussed groceries, schedules, appointments, nothing that mattered, nothing that could be used, because everything that mattered had already been weaponized. In this house, silence was safer than honesty, distance was safer than closeness, and routine was safer than change. At night, they slept in separate rooms, not out of anger, but out of caution. Dreams are careless. Sleep makes people speak. Vulnerability invites mistakes. Mistakes create consequences, and consequences in this marriage were final. The property was the pressure point, a piece of land, a house, a title tied to conditions that could not be ignored forever, ownership that required a resolution, resolution that required legal clarity. Clarity demanded divorce, and divorce demanded exposure. As long as they remained legally bound, the property stayed frozen, untouched, unclaimed, a constant reminder that time was not on their side. The longer they stayed married, the safer their secrets remained. The longer they stayed married, the closer the danger crept. Leaving was impossible. Staying was dangerous. Every morning they woke up knowing this balance could fail, that one misstep, a misplaced file, a curious official, an unexpected audit could tip everything. They did not need to threaten each other. They had already done the math. This was not a marriage anymore. It was a negotiated silence.
A ceasefire signed without witnesses. And like all ceasefires, it depended on one fragile belief, that neither side would decide the risk was worth it. Because the moment one of them did, everything would come out.
Before the silence, before the calculations, before knowledge became leverage, there was a beginning. It did not feel dangerous at the time. It did not feel complicated. It felt ordinary in the way most lives begin. Two people moving through the same city, carrying private ambitions, unaware they were on a path toward each other. They met during a season when both were trying to build something, not comfort, not luxury, just stability, the kind that allows you to breathe without constantly looking over your shoulder. The husband was younger then, driven, restless, intensely focused on progress. He believed deeply in momentum, in forward motion, in the idea that success, once reached, could correct whatever compromises were made along the way. He spoke about the future with confidence, career plans, positions he wanted to hold, a life where his name would mean something. The wife was equally determined, though quieter about it. She believed in structure, in systems, in preparation. Where he chased opportunity, she analyzed risk. Where he talked about what could be, she paid attention to what already was. She understood numbers, patterns, the way institutions worked, and the way they failed. They met through proximity, shared circles, mutual acquaintances, conversations that started with polite interest and slowly lengthened. Coffee turned into routine, routine turned into familiarity, familiarity created trust. They liked that they understood each other's hunger. Neither of them came from excess. Both knew what it meant to feel delayed by circumstance, to be intelligent but blocked, capable but unseen. They talked often about how unfair the system could be, how doors seemed to open easily for some and remain permanently closed for others. At the time, these conversations felt harmless, even bonding. They encouraged each other, shared resources, compared notes, exchanged ideas about how to move forward faster, about how to avoid stagnation, about how to make the world bend just enough to allow entry. When they decided to commit, it felt practical and emotional at the same time. Love was present, yes, but so was partnership. They believed they would be stronger together, that marriage would provide balance, support, cover. They married before they were fully established, before careers were secure, before finances were comfortable. They told themselves they would grow into stability together. And at first, they did. They struggled in ordinary ways, tight budgets, long hours, delayed gratification, the kind of strain that often strengthens a bond. They shared late nights planning, revising goals, encouraging each other not to give up. This is where the first compromises appeared. They were small, easy to justify, so minor they barely registered as choices. The husband faced a barrier early in his career, a requirement that felt arbitrary, a credential that took time he did not have, money he could not yet afford. He was already doing the work, already capable, already trusted in informal spaces. The paper was the only thing missing. At first, he delayed. Then he researched alternatives. Then he listened to suggestions he would have rejected before. Suggestions that framed shortcuts as temporary solutions, placeholders, bridges. He told himself it was only until he could correct it properly, that once he was inside the system, fixing the detail would be easy, that competence mattered more than documentation. The wife knew about this moment. She did not object. She asked questions instead, practical ones. What institution would review it? How often? Under what conditions? She helped him think through exposure, not because she wanted to protect wrongdoing, but because she believed in preparation. She told herself it was temporary. He told himself it was necessary. At the same time, she faced her own pressures. Her work exposed her to financial systems that were inefficient and flawed. She noticed inconsistencies, gaps, processes that relied too heavily on assumption and repetition. She saw how easily numbers could move without immediate scrutiny. At first it was curiosity, then opportunity, then quiet experimentation. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless. She justified it as optimization, as learning how systems truly operated, as gaining leverage in a world that favored institutions over individuals. She kept records, not because she felt guilty, but because documentation made her feel secure. Information was control, proof was protection. The husband did not ask too many questions. He trusted her competence, her discipline. He believed her work was complex, not dangerous. He believed marriage meant respect for privacy. They were both lying, but softly, gently, almost kindly. Each believed the lie would end before it mattered. They still loved each other then. Shared meals, shared jokes, shared frustration. They still planned vacations they never quite took. They still believed their future would be clean, orderly, and deserved. The lies stayed small because they were never challenged. Success began to arrive. The husband's career advanced faster than expected. Doors opened, invitations followed. The forged credential did its job silently. No alarms, no questions. Each passing year made it harder to imagine confessing, but also easier to believe it would never be discovered. The wife's financial maneuvers grew more sophisticated, still controlled, still quiet, still carefully recorded. She told herself she was only doing what institutions already did, only on a smaller scale, with more awareness. They moved into a better home, improved their standard of living. Their conversations shifted from survival to maintenance, from ambition to preservation. And this is where love began to change, not disappear, but adjust. They stopped sharing everything, not deliberately, just gradually. Some topics felt safer untouched, some details felt unnecessary to explain. They assumed trust could survive omission. They were wrong. The first moment of real tension did not arrive as an argument, it arrived as recognition. A casual comment, a question asked too carefully, a look held half a second too long. The wife noticed how defensive the husband became around credentials, how quickly he redirected conversations about verification, how alert he was to administrative reviews. The husband noticed how methodical she was with records, how little she ever discarded, how she spoke about financial systems with the calm of someone who knew where the weak points were. They did not confront each other. They watched. Each discovery was slow, fragmented, pieced together from behavior rather than confession. Each realization brought a new awareness. The person they loved was not only ambitious, but capable of crossing lines. This knowledge should have driven them apart. Instead, it bound them closer, for a time. Because each believed the other's secret was still temporary. They believed that once success stabilized, the shortcuts could be erased, that love would justify forgiveness, that the past could be corrected quietly. They told themselves this because the alternative was unbearable. To admit that survival had begun to replace affection would mean admitting that the marriage itself was changing shape. They stayed together because it was easier than asking what they had become. But every small lie, once tolerated, learned how to grow. And eventually, it learned how to wait. At what point does survival replace affection? They did not ask that question then. They were too busy building lives that required silence to stand. And silence, once accepted, never stays small.
The husband's career did not collapse into deception overnight. It advanced into it, step by step, through choices that felt reasonable at the time. The forged certificate was not created in a moment of recklessness. It was the result of pressure, delays, missed opportunities, years of being told he was capable but incomplete, qualified in skill but lacking one final requirement that stood between him and progress. He had already done the work. He had already learned the systems. He had already proven himself in unofficial ways. Supervisors trusted his output. Colleagues relied on his judgment. Clients responded to his confidence. But the system did not reward confidence, it rewarded documentation. At first, he told himself he would wait, that he would gather the resources, take the proper steps, and complete the requirement legitimately. But time passed, bills accumulated, peers advanced ahead of him, openings closed while he hesitated. That was when the suggestion appeared. It did not arrive as a criminal proposal, it arrived as advice, a whispered solution framed as common practice, a quiet assurance that everyone did it, that the paper mattered less than performance, that once inside, no one ever looked back. He resisted at first, then he asked questions, then he listened. The certificate was obtained through channels designed to look official. Formatting was accurate, language precise, institutional seals replicated with care. It passed casual inspection easily. It was designed not to impress, but to blend in. The husband told himself it was temporary, just a placeholder, a bridge to legitimacy. He submitted it once. Nothing happened. No alarms, no phone calls, no investigations. Encouraged, he submitted it again and again. With each use, confidence replaced hesitation. With each approval, fear retreated slightly further into the background. Soon, the certificate was no longer a risk, it was a tool. His career accelerated. Positions opened. Titles followed. His name began to circulate in professional spaces. Invitations arrived. His opinions carried weight. He dressed the part, spoke the language, adopted the posture of someone who belonged, and the world accepted him. That acceptance became addictive. The more respected he became, the harder it was to imagine losing it. The more visible he became, the more effort he put into appearing flawless. He memorized timelines, anticipated questions, learned which documents were reviewed and which were never touched. He studied systems not to improve them, but to avoid them. Every email from an administrative office caused a pause. Every audit announcement tightened his chest. Every request for verification, no matter how routine, demanded careful attention. He developed habits. He checked official portals at specific times. He avoided unnecessary profile updates. He never volunteered documents unless requested. He kept copies of everything in multiple formats, organized meticulously. Control became his shield. From the outside, he appeared calm, reliable, composed, the kind of professional people trusted instinctively. He offered advice, mentored juniors, spoke confidently about compliance and ethics. Inside, he carried a constant awareness. One verification check could end everything. Not just his job, but his identity. The certificate was not just paper anymore. It was the foundation beneath his name. Remove it, and everything above would collapse. His wife noticed the changes before she knew the reason. She noticed how he reacted to official correspondence, how he read emails slowly, sometimes twice before responding, how he avoided certain conversations entirely, how he preferred not to discuss the early stages of his career. At first, she attributed it to stress, to responsibility, to the weight of success. But patterns are difficult to hide from someone who studies systems. She noticed how he deflected questions about credentials with practiced ease, how his stories about training were vague, inconsistent in small ways, how he remembered outcomes clearly but skipped processes. She did not accuse him, she observed. One evening she asked a question casually, the kind of question people ask without intention, where he completed a particular requirement, what year, which institution. He answered quickly, too quickly. She asked another question days later, similar, slightly altered. The answer changed, not dramatically, just enough. That was when she knew. She did not confront him. She verified, quietly, indirectly, through channels he never noticed, public records, informal inquiries, cross-referenced details. The absence was clear. The credential did not exist where it should. She felt no shock, no anger, only clarity. The man she had married had built his life on paper that could disappear at any moment. She understood immediately what this meant. The respect he commanded was conditional. The authority he held was fragile. His entire public existence depended on continued silence. From that moment on, the marriage changed. The husband sensed it, though he did not know why at first. He felt the shift in her attention, the precision of her questions, the way she listened without responding, how she avoided certain conversations entirely, how he preferred not to discuss the early stages of his career. At first, he attributed it to stress, to responsibility, to the weight of success. But patterns are difficult to hide from someone who studies systems. She noticed how he deflected questions about credentials with practiced ease, how his stories about training were vague, inconsistent in small ways, how he remembered outcomes clearly but skipped processes. She did not accuse him, she observed. One evening she asked a question casually, the kind of question people ask without intention, where he completed a particular requirement, what year, which institution. He answered quickly, too quickly. She asked another question days later, similar, slightly altered. The answer changed, not dramatically, just enough. That was when she knew. She did not confront him. She verified, quietly, indirectly, through channels he never noticed, public records, informal inquiries, cross-referenced details. The absence was clear. The credential did not exist where it should. She felt no shock, no anger, only clarity. The man she had married had built his life on paper that could disappear at any moment. She understood immediately what this meant. The respect he commanded was conditional. The authority he held was fragile. His entire public existence depended on continued silence. From that moment on, the marriage changed. The husband sensed it, though he did not know why at first. He felt the shift in her attention, the precision of her questions, the way she listened without responding, how she avoided certain conversations entirely, how he preferred not to discuss the early stages of his career. At first, he attributed it to stress, to responsibility, to the weight of success. But patterns are difficult to hide from someone who studies systems. She noticed how he deflected questions about credentials with practiced ease, how his stories about training were vague, inconsistent in small ways, how he remembered outcomes clearly but skipped processes. She did not accuse him, she observed. One evening she asked a question casually, the kind of question people ask without intention, where he completed a particular requirement, what year, which institution. He answered quickly, too quickly. She asked another question days later, similar, slightly altered. The answer changed, not dramatically, just enough. That was when she knew. She did not confront him. She verified, quietly, indirectly, through channels he never noticed, public records, informal inquiries, cross-referenced details. The absence was clear. The credential did not exist where it should. She felt no shock, no anger, only clarity. The man she had married had built his life on paper that could disappear at any moment. She understood immediately what this meant. The respect he commanded was conditional. The authority he held was fragile. His entire public existence depended on continued silence. From that moment on, the marriage changed. The husband sensed it, though he did not know why at first. He felt the shift in her attention, the precision of her questions, the way she listened without responding, how she avoided certain conversations entirely, how he preferred not to discuss the early stages of his career. At first, he attributed it to stress, to responsibility, to the weight of success. But patterns are difficult to hide from someone who studies systems. She noticed how he deflected questions about credentials with practiced ease, how his stories about training were vague, inconsistent in small ways,
how he remembered outcomes clearly but skipped processes. She did not accuse him, she observed. One evening she asked a question casually, the kind of question people ask without intention, where he completed a particular.
If the husband's secret was built on paper, the wife's secret was built on systems. Her actions did not begin with intention to break rules. They began with observation, with curiosity shaped by experience, with long hours spent watching how money moved without being seen, how responsibility dissolved across departments, how accountability was often assumed rather than confirmed. She worked close enough to financial structures to understand their rhythms, close enough to notice how repetition created trust and how trust created blind spots. She learned early that numbers, when presented correctly, rarely raised questions. At first, she followed every rule, every guideline, every protocol. She was precise, reliable, the kind of professional institutions depend on. But precision brings familiarity, and familiarity reveals weaknesses. She saw how accounts could be opened through intermediaries, how verification depended on matching patterns rather than understanding intent, how identity, once accepted, could operate freely as long as it behaved consistently. She did not act immediately. She watched. She studied cases where errors went unnoticed, where responsibility was diffused, where audits corrected outcomes without asking why those outcomes existed in the first place. When she finally took her first step beyond the line, it was small, a test, a movement of funds that mimicked legitimate activity so closely it became indistinguishable. She observed the response. There was none. No alerts, no follow-up, no questions. That silence was instructive. She expanded carefully, never too fast, never in ways that attracted attention. She used proxy accounts designed to look unrelated, names that existed on paper but left no trace in daily life, transactions that blended into expected flows. She treated the process like architecture, balanced, structured, designed to support weight without revealing its framework. These were not impulsive acts. They were measured, planned, executed with patience. She justified them internally as correction rather than theft, as redistribution within systems already misaligned, as compensation for years of stagnation. But justification did not mean ignorance. She knew exactly what she was doing. And because she knew, she documented everything, not out of carelessness, but control. She kept records because records meant clarity, dates, amounts, pathways, every movement mapped, every account connected to an origin point only she understood. She believed documentation gave her power. Without it, she would be operating blindly. With it, she could always prove what had happened, how it happened, and why. She never relied on memory. Memory fades, records remain. The evidence was organized with the same discipline she applied to her public life. Physical copies stored carefully, digital files encrypted and duplicated, access methods memorized rather than written down. And the most critical pieces were placed somewhere designed for permanence. A bank, not an account meant for daily use, not something visible on statements, a controlled space, a compartment protected by policy, procedure, and distance, a safe deposit box, steel doors, numbered access, time-stamped entries, a place that required identification, confirmation, and authorization. She chose it because it was impersonal. The bank did not care what was stored there. It cared only that rules were followed, that access was logged, that contents were untouched. In that space, she stored proof of her actions, not because she intended to confess, not because she feared forgetting, but because she understood leverage.
She didn't hide her crimes to forget them. She hid them to survive. The evidence existed because it had to. Without it, she would have no way to negotiate if things went wrong, no way to prove boundaries, no way to demonstrate awareness. Evidence to her was insurance. It ensured that if she was ever challenged, she would not be powerless. It meant that consequences, if they came, would not be one-sided. She trusted systems more than people. Systems, at least, behaved consistently. At home, her demeanor never changed. She remained controlled, organized, predictable in routine. She did not display guilt because guilt suggested instability. Her husband did not notice the details at first. He assumed her discipline was simply her nature, that her caution was professional habit, that her meticulous record-keeping reflected diligence, not risk. But over time, he began to sense boundaries, locked drawers, passwords that changed regularly, devices she never left unattended, documents she personally transported rather than digitally. He noticed how she spoke about banks, not with reverence or fear, but familiarity, as if she understood not just how they operated, but where they stopped paying attention. When he learned about the existence of the safe deposit box, it was incidental, a passing reference, an offhand comment about renewing access authorization. He asked what she kept there. She answered calmly, "Documents." That answer was accurate and incomplete. He did not press. He did not need to, because by then he already understood something fundamental about her. She was not reckless. She was prepared. As his own fear of exposure intensified, he began to view her actions differently, not as distant professional habits, but as parallel strategies. He recognized the same caution in her that he practiced himself. They were not opposites, they were mirrors. She managed risk by storing proof. He managed risk by avoiding inspection. Two approaches to the same problem. Her crimes did not escalate dramatically, they expanded quietly. The scale increased, but the pattern remained controlled. She knew when to stop, when to pause, when to let accounts rest. She believed moderation would protect her, and it did, for a time. But evidence has weight. The more she accumulated, the more valuable it became, the more dangerous it became, the more it transformed from protection into burden. She understood that the very records that safeguarded her could also destroy her if discovered, that the safe deposit box was both shield and threat. She accepted this trade-off because she believed she controlled access. She trusted the bank. She trusted procedure. She believed that anonymity could be maintained indefinitely. What she underestimated was proximity. The most dangerous person in any system is not an investigator. It is someone who already knows where to look. Her husband did not know the contents of the box, but he knew it existed. He knew its location. He knew its significance. That knowledge changed the marriage irreversibly, because now both of them possessed something the other could not afford to lose. At home, conversations became even more careful. Neutral topics dominated. Emotional distance widened. They shared space without sharing truth. She watched him closely, aware that his public life rested on a single vulnerable point. He watched her closely, aware that her control depended on evidence stored beyond their walls. They never acknowledged the symmetry, but it governed everything. Her crimes were not loud. They did not announce themselves. They existed quietly within systems designed to absorb irregularities without protest. But silence does not mean safety. It only means delay. She believed she had accounted for every risk. She believed she had prepared for every outcome. What she had not prepared for was the moment when survival would demand that evidence stop being insurance and start being leverage. And once evidence becomes leverage, it stops belonging to the person who created it. It belongs to the situation that demands its use. By the time she realized this, the marriage was no longer a partnership. It was a shared containment unit, two people guarding secrets that could destroy them both. And behind steel doors, waiting patiently, was proof that neither of them could truly control anymore.
There was no single conversation where everything was revealed, no confession, no accusation, no moment where voices rose and truths were forced into the open. What happened instead was quieter and far more permanent. The husband realized first, not because she told him, but because she stopped asking the wrong questions. She no longer inquired about his work in the way someone curious would. She stopped pretending not to understand institutional language. Her interest shifted from outcomes to procedures, from results to verification. She began to reference things casually, a department name, an accreditation process, a regulatory term used correctly but unnecessarily. At first, he assumed coincidence, shared exposure, general knowledge picked up through conversation. Then the references became precise, too precise. One evening, during a conversation that appeared to be about scheduling, she mentioned an internal review cycle. The timing was accurate, the phrasing exact, not something someone outside his professional environment would know instinctively. He responded carefully. He always did, but something changed in the way she watched him afterward. Not suspicion, not curiosity, confirmation. That was when he understood. She knew. Not suspected, not guessed, knew. The realization settled slowly, like weight redistributing itself. He did not react. He did not adjust his tone. He finished the conversation exactly as planned. But inside, the balance of the marriage shifted. He began replaying past interactions with new awareness. Questions that once felt casual now revealed intention. Comments he had dismissed now carried meaning. Moments of silence that once felt comfortable now appeared deliberate. She had been mapping him, and she had reached her conclusion. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened, and that was the most unsettling part. She did not confront him. She did not threaten him. She did not demand explanation. Instead, she adjusted her behavior slightly, almost imperceptibly. She became more confident in conversations about institutions, more relaxed when discussing audits in general terms. She spoke as if systems were neutral tools, neither threatening nor protective. She did this knowing he was listening differently now. Every word had two meanings. On his side, the husband became more aware of her silences, of the way she paused before responding, of the way she sometimes let statements hang, unanswered. He noticed how she began to mention the bank more often, not directly, never explicitly, but as part of unrelated discussions. Security, storage, access protocols. Once, she mentioned safe deposit boxes in a conversation about inheritance planning. He felt the shift immediately. She was not sharing information. She was placing markers. The wife realized his awareness not through his words, but through restraint. He stopped asking questions entirely. Where once he had shown mild curiosity about her routines, her documents, her careful habits, now he avoided them altogether. He did not look at her devices. He did not comment on her organization. He behaved like someone who had learned the cost of attention. That told her everything. If he had been innocent, he would have asked. Silence meant calculation. From that moment on, both of them understood the truth without naming it. They were no longer married to each other. They were married to what they knew. The house became a place of coded communication. A comment about news became a reminder of consequences. A reference to policy changes became a suggestion. A shared glance became an acknowledgement of boundaries. Nothing was said outright because nothing needed to be. They both understood that confrontation would serve no purpose. There was nothing to negotiate yet,
no immediate demand, no benefit to escalation. Instead, they confirmed awareness subtly. Once, during dinner, the husband mentioned a colleague who had been removed from a position due to a documentation issue. He described it neutrally, without judgment, without detail. The wife responded calmly. Systems tend to correct themselves eventually. Her tone was even, her expression unchanged. He nodded. That exchange said more than any argument could. On another occasion, she mentioned how banks maintain access logs indefinitely, how entries are recorded whether or not contents are reviewed. He did not ask why she brought it up. He simply acknowledged the point. From then on, their interactions followed new rules. They avoided personal topics entirely. There was no benefit to emotional exposure. Vulnerability had become risk. Instead, conversations were logistical, functional, efficient. Who would be home late? What bills needed attention? Which maintenance issues required action? But underneath every neutral exchange ran a second dialogue, a conversation about timing, about patience, about limits. The birth of mutual blackmail did not feel dramatic. It felt administrative. Each of them now possessed something that could end the other's life as they knew it, not through force, but through process, through official channels, through verification and disclosure. Neither of them wanted to be the first to act, because acting meant losing control. The threat was never spoken, because speaking it reduced its value. Once a threat is voiced, it becomes specific. Specific threats invite countermeasures. Silence allowed flexibility. Silence allowed fear to do the work. The husband understood that as long as she remained calm, his secret remained contained. But that calm was conditional, dependent on balance, on mutual restraint. The wife understood that as long as he remained compliant, her evidence remained dormant. But compliance had limits, and those limits were approaching. Love did not vanish overnight. It reconfigured. What once felt like care became monitoring. What once felt like support became negotiation. What once felt like partnership became containment. They still shared space, still shared meals, still shared legal status, but emotionally they had shifted into positions. Every decision was now strategic. If one of them changed routine, the other noticed. If one of them delayed a response, the other interpreted it. If one of them seemed too relaxed, the other questioned why. The silence between them grew heavier, not with emotion, but with information. Neither could leave. Leaving would activate systems, lawyers, filings, reviews. Each step outward would bring scrutiny inward. Neither could push. Pushing would invite retaliation. So they existed in suspension, a marriage maintained by mutual risk. They learned to speak in ways that revealed nothing while implying everything. They mastered neutral language, learned how to say enough to be understood without saying anything that could be recorded. Silence became the loudest element in the house. It filled rooms, sat between them at meals, followed them through hallways. And silence, unlike words, could not be denied. At night, they lay awake in separate rooms, aware of the same truth. They were no longer choosing each other. They were choosing delay, because delay preserved the balance. Because as long as neither moved, both remained intact. But this balance was fragile. It depended on continued restraint, on patience, on the belief that coexistence was still safer than exposure. Love had collapsed into strategy. Affection had been replaced by assessment, and trust, once broken quietly, had been replaced by leverage. Neither of them knew how long the ceasefire would last. They only knew what would happen when it ended. Because once love becomes leverage, the marriage is already over. What remains is only timing.
The property entered their marriage quietly. It had existed long before the silence, before the leverage, before the careful restraint that now governed their lives. At first, it was only a background concern, a future matter, something to be addressed when time allowed. But time does not wait for permission. The property was not merely land or walls or boundaries drawn on paper. It was history. It was documentation layered over decades. It was ownership tied to conditions that no longer fit neatly into the present. It came from inheritance, not a clean transfer, not a simple handover, but a chain of possession interrupted by missing confirmations, outdated records, and unresolved claims. A property passed down without modern clarity, promises made verbally, agreements never updated, names that appeared and disappeared across documents without explanation. When it first became relevant, they approached it as a shared issue, something they would solve together, as they had solved other challenges in the early years of their marriage. They gathered files, reviewed old papers, contacted offices that moved slowly and answered vaguely. Each inquiry produced more questions than answers. The problem became clear over time. Ownership could not be finalized without legal resolution. Legal resolution required clarity of status, and clarity of status required divorce. As long as they remained married, the property remained frozen. Joint ownership laws applied. Inheritance conditions remained incomplete. Certain transfers could not proceed without updated declarations. Institutions required confirmation that no competing claims existed. Those confirmations did not exist. At first, the idea of divorce was theoretical, a legal step, not an emotional one, a technical adjustment. They discussed it in neutral terms, no anger, no blame. But beneath the surface, both of them understood what divorce meant. Divorce meant filings. Filings meant records. Records meant review. Review meant attention, and attention was dangerous. For the husband, divorce would trigger background verification, career disclosures, financial reviews, identity confirmation. Even if indirect, even if delayed, the process would create exposure pathways he had spent years avoiding. For the wife, divorce would mean financial scrutiny, asset declarations, historical transactions, requests for explanations, a closer look at patterns she had carefully dispersed. Divorce was not just separation, it was examination. The property demanded it anyway. The land could not be sold, the structure could not be renovated, the value could not be realized. Every attempt to move forward encountered the same barrier, marital status unresolved. They delayed. They postponed meetings, ignored follow-up letters, asked for extensions. Each delay bought time, but increased pressure. The property did not forget. New notices arrived. Deadlines appeared. External parties expressed interest. Local authorities requested clarification. Each request carried a deadline and a file number. The property began to assert itself. It was no longer passive, it was active. It generated paperwork. It created visibility. It demanded decisions. The husband felt the pressure first. The value of the property was substantial, enough to change his future, enough to justify risk, enough to tempt him toward action. He began to imagine a life beyond the marriage, a future where he could liquidate the asset, stabilize his finances, and perhaps finally correct the shortcut he had taken years earlier. But every imagined path required one impossible step: divorce. The wife understood the danger immediately. She read the letters carefully, studied the language, noted which institutions were involved, which offices were copied, which departments were responsible. She saw exposure paths everywhere. Divorce would not only open financial records, it would open history, timelines, associations, patterns. The property was no longer neutral. It was a catalyst. The more they tried to ignore it, the more it pushed back. Lawyers began to circle. Not aggressively, not suspiciously, just professionally. Requests for clarification, offers of assistance, questions about status. Each lawyer represented a system, and systems do not forget unanswered questions. The husband suggested options: temporary separation, delayed filings, alternative arrangements. Each suggestion failed under scrutiny.
None resolved the ownership issue, none satisfied legal requirements, none prevented eventual review. The wife countered with caution. She recommended waiting, monitoring, allowing the situation to remain unresolved. She framed delay as protection, and she was right. As long as the property remained frozen, their secrets remained dormant. But frozen assets attract attention. Unresolved ownership invites inquiry. Inheritance disputes generate audits. Delays prompt oversight. The property did not allow silence. It demanded clarity, and clarity demanded exposure. At home, the property became a constant presence, not physically, but psychologically. It entered conversations indirectly. Schedules were rearranged around meetings they never attended. Letters were stacked unopened, then moved, then returned. Each envelope carried risk. The husband began to feel cornered. He saw the property as an exit that was being denied, a solution blocked by fear. He resented the delay, even as he understood it. The wife saw the property as a threat masquerading as opportunity, a force that would drag them into systems that neither could survive. They didn't argue about it. Arguments create records. Records create consequences. Instead, they discussed it strategically. Timing, options, risk assessment. Each conversation felt like negotiation rather than discussion. The property forced them to acknowledge a truth they had avoided. Their marriage was no longer a partnership. It was an obstacle, but dissolving it would expose everything. This is where the property became the third entity. It was not on either side. It did not care about balance. It did not respect silence. It existed outside their control, governed by rules that did not bend for fear. Every attempt to contain it failed. They consulted documents from decades earlier, discovered signatures that could not be verified, names that no longer appeared in databases, agreements that referenced institutions that had since merged or dissolved. The past had not been cleaned properly, and now it demanded attention. They began to realize something unsettling. The property was not a prize, it was a test. It tested how long they could maintain restraint, how long silence could hold, how much risk they were willing to tolerate. The longer they delayed, the more the property accumulated administrative weight, the more entities became involved, the more records were generated. Each record was a potential thread. Pull one and something unraveled. The psychological pressure intensified. The husband felt trapped between desire and survival. He wanted resolution. He wanted movement. He wanted the asset to fulfill its promise, but every movement meant scrutiny. The wife understood the danger immediately. She wanted containment, stability, continued silence. She understood that as long as nothing moved, nothing collapsed. But emotion had a cost. The property did not allow stagnation. It forced deadlines, created consequences for inaction, generated interest from parties who did not care about personal risk. They began to realize that the property was doing what neither of them had dared to do. It was forcing exposure, not intentionally, not maliciously, structurally, by existing within legal frameworks that required truth. Secrets that once felt isolated were now liabilities. They were no longer private risks. They were obstacles preventing progress. The husband's forged credential became a barrier to divorce. The wife's hidden records became a barrier to financial disclosure. The property turned their separate crimes into shared consequences. They didn't fight over the property fought back. It applied pressure without emotion, without intent, without mercy. It revealed the fragility of their arrangement. Their ceasefire depended on stasis. The property demanded resolution. At night, they considered the same question from opposite sides. How long could this be delayed? Neither of them had an answer, because the property was no longer waiting for them. It had entered the marriage as a third presence, one that did not care who fell first, only that something had to give.
When the idea of divorce could no longer be avoided, it did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as paperwork. Quiet inquiries, carefully worded emails, appointments scheduled under neutral descriptions. The husband was the first to test the boundary. He did not announce his intention. He did not frame it as separation.
He approached it as research. Hypothetical questions, general consultations that avoided names and dates. He wanted to know what divorce required in practice, what disclosures were mandatory, what timelines existed, which institutions were notified automatically. Each answer carried weight. Divorce was not a single action, it was a sequence, and every step in that sequence triggered another process. Asset declarations, employment confirmations, financial histories, identity verification. The system assumed transparency. It was built on the expectation that people entering it had nothing to hide. That assumption made it dangerous. The husband learned quickly that there was no such thing as a discrete divorce. Even preliminary filings created digital traces. Even informal mediation involved documentation. There were no shortcuts here. Every path forward passed through review. He brought the information home cautiously, presenting it as concern rather than intent. He spoke about complications, about delays, about risks that needed careful handling. The wife listened without interruption. She already knew. She had run the same scenarios in her mind long before he spoke. She understood that divorce would not just separate them, it would activate layers of oversight they had spent years avoiding. She responded calmly, not with refusal, with cooperation. She agreed that divorce required planning, that timing mattered, that care was necessary. Her agreement was not consent, it was containment. She suggested waiting for the property situation to stabilize, for external interest to cool, for deadlines to be extended. Her tone was reasonable, supportive, logical. But beneath her words was a message: not yet. The husband felt the resistance immediately. It was not overt obstruction, it was delay. Delay framed as prudence. He pushed gently. He mentioned how unresolved marriage status complicated the property, how uncertainty carried its own risks, how action might be safer than inaction. She agreed, partially. Yes, uncertainty was risky. Yes, action would eventually be required. But not this action, not now. Every suggestion he made was met with acceptance, followed by redirection, alternative steps, additional assessments, reasons to pause. Each pause tightened the situation. Because time did not reduce risk, it redistributed it. The husband began contacting lawyers more directly, still discreetly, still cautiously. He described the situation in abstract terms: a marriage with complex assets, a desire for quiet resolution. No conflict, he emphasized, just clarity. The lawyers listened, and then they asked questions. Questions he could not answer without revealing too much. Questions about employment verification, about asset origin, about historical transactions, about timing. He deflected, redirected, kept answers vague. The lawyers noticed. They did not accuse, they adjusted. Their tone became more formal, their advice more guarded. They recommended documentation, verification, transparency. One of them suggested that unresolved details could complicate proceedings significantly. Another mentioned that institutions often review records more closely during marital dissolution. The husband left those meetings unsettled. The system was not designed for silence. It was designed to extract information. At home, the wife began making her own moves. She contacted a lawyer as well. Her approach mirrored his: hypothetical, general, careful. She emphasized the importance of asset protection, of minimizing exposure, of preserving privacy. The lawyer listened and hesitated. Privacy, they explained, had limits. Divorce required disclosure. Financial separation required clarity. If there were complexities, they would surface. The wife thanked them politely. She did not ask follow-up questions. She already understood the implication. The law did not care about balance. it cared about truth. The husband and wife began to communicate less directly about divorce, not because the topic disappeared, but because it became too dangerous to discuss openly. Instead, they spoke around it, about timing, about readiness, about external conditions. Each conversation was layered. When the husband mentioned urgency, the wife heard risk. When the wife mentioned caution, the husband heard obstruction. They were no longer aligned, but neither could say it. Threats entered the marriage quietly, not as ultimatums, as suggestions. The husband mentioned how prolonged delay could draw attention from external parties, how unresolved property issues could prompt audits, how institutions disliked stagnation. The wife responded by referencing the dangers of rushed decisions, how mistakes during legal processes are permanent, how exposure once triggered could not be reversed. Each spoke politely, each threatened indirectly. Their cooperation became conditional. When one proposed a step forward, the other offered support, paired with a warning. Yes, but this could happen. Yes, but that might follow. The message was clear: move carefully or don't move at all. Lawyers began to sense something was wrong, not because of any single detail, but because of pattern. The hesitation, the reluctance to provide full information, the emphasis on discretion over resolution. Experienced professionals recognize avoidance. They understand when clients are protecting something unseen. The lawyers did not press, they documented. And documentation is the beginning of danger. Each consultation created a file. Each inquiry left a trace. Each note became part of a record. The system was waking up. The husband noticed subtle changes. Responses from institutions slowed. Requests became more formal. Language shifted from helpful to procedural. The wife noticed it too. She saw how delays were no longer neutral, how postponement itself became suspicious, how unresolved matters invited oversight. They were trapped in a narrowing corridor. Every legal move tightened the noose. Attempting divorce created exposure. Avoiding divorce created attention. There was no safe option left. The system itself became dangerous. It did not need intention. It did not need malice. It operated on protocol. Protocols demanded information. Information demanded truth. And truth was the one thing neither of them could provide fully. At night, they lay awake in separate rooms, thinking through scenarios. What if one of them filed unilaterally? What if an external party forced resolution? What if a lawyer flagged irregularities? Each possibility ended the same way: exposure. The marriage, once a shield, had become a trap. Staying married blocked progress. Ending the marriage triggered scrutiny. They had built a life that could only exist in suspension, and suspension could not last. The husband began to feel the pressure internally, a constant tension between urgency and fear. He felt time closing in, deadlines approaching, options disappearing. The wife felt it too, but differently. She felt the weight of control slipping, of evidence becoming heavier, of leverage losing effectiveness as external forces entered the equation. They were no longer fighting each other. They were fighting the system. And the system did not negotiate. It processed. Each day without resolution added another layer of risk, another document, another unanswered question. The lawyers continued to wait. The institutions continued to follow up. The property continued to demand clarity. The divorce that couldn't happen became the center of everything. Not because either of them wanted separation, but because separation had become the only way forward, and the most dangerous one. They had reached a point where inaction was no longer neutral. It was a decision with consequences. And whatever choice came next would not belong to them alone. Because once the system fully engaged, control would no longer rest inside the marriage. It would rest in files, processes, and decisions made far from their reach. The ceasefire was failing.
not through confrontation, but through procedure. And procedure does not care who survives it.
The first crack did not arrive with noise. It arrived as a pause, a delay in response time, a request that lingered unanswered longer than expected, a routine process that failed to conclude on schedule. At first, neither of them acknowledged it. Delays had become familiar. Silence had become strategy. They were accustomed to waiting, to stretching time thin enough to pass unnoticed. But this delay felt different. It did not resolve itself. The husband noticed it during a routine interaction at work. A verification request that should have cleared within days remained open. No rejection, no approval, just a status marked pending longer than any previous instance. He refreshed the system repeatedly, checked internal notices, reviewed his submitted documents. Everything appeared in order. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it unsettled him. Systems did not pause without reason. He told himself it was administrative backlog, staffing changes, technical issues, common explanations that usually held. But this time, the pause lingered. At home, the wife experienced something similar. She received a notification from the bank, routine in tone, polite, procedural, a request to confirm access authorization details related to a safe deposit box. Nothing alarming on its own, except for the timing. The notification referenced a review cycle she had not expected. It asked for confirmation of identification protocols that had not been updated in years. She read the message carefully, twice. Then she deleted it from her inbox, not because she wanted to erase it, but because she needed time to think before responding. The ceasefire had depended on balance. Balance depended on predictability, and predictability was beginning to fail. The third party entered the situation quietly, not as an investigator, not as an accuser, as an observer. A junior administrator at the husband's workplace noticed an inconsistency while processing records. Nothing dramatic, just a formatting difference between older files and newer submissions, a minor discrepancy in naming convention, the kind of detail most people ignored. But this administrator was thorough. They flagged the file for clarification, not escalation, clarification. That flag changed everything. The husband became aware of it through an automated notification, neutral language, no accusation, just a request for confirmation. He felt the familiar tightening of awareness. He prepared his response carefully, provided documentation, explained the variation as a clerical update. He had done this before. It had always worked. But this time, the follow-up came faster. Another request, another clarification. The questions were still polite, but they were becoming specific. At the bank, the wife experienced her own disturbance. During a routine visit to manage unrelated matters, she noticed a familiar face behind the counter, a bank employee she had encountered years earlier during one of her early interactions. She had not expected to see them again. Banks rotate staff, branches change, familiarity fades, but the employee remembered her. Not clearly, not immediately, just enough. A brief pause, a searching look, a polite greeting followed by hesitation. The wife recognized the shift instantly. Recognition does not need certainty to be dangerous. It only needs curiosity. The employee did not say anything unusual. They completed the transaction professionally, but their tone carried awareness, as if a memory was trying to place itself. The wife left the bank calmly, but something had changed. At home, she reviewed her records again, checked access logs, reviewed dates, confirmed entries. Everything was intact. That did not comfort her, because intact records meant exposure pathways remained open. The document appeared 2 days later. The husband found it in a shared digital folder they rarely used, a scanned copy of an old verification request, time-stamped incorrectly, filed under a category that did not apply. He did not recognize uploading it. He did not recognize the timestamp. It should not have been there.
He stared at the screen longer than necessary, absorbing the implication. Documents do not move themselves. Someone or something had accessed archived material. He did not mention it to his wife. He closed the file, logged out, cleared his session history. Then he sat quietly, replaying every recent interaction. At the same time, the wife noticed something else. A minor discrepancy in her digital records, a metadata change, a file accessed more recently than she remembered. She checked timestamps, cross-referenced backups. The file had been opened, not altered, just opened. That was enough. Paranoia did not arrive as panic. It arrived as vigilance intensified. Both of them became hyper-aware. Every sound felt informative. Every notification felt loaded. Every delay felt intentional. The husband began monitoring internal systems more frequently. He adjusted routines, avoided unnecessary interactions, declined opportunities that involved additional scrutiny. He felt his control slipping, not through exposure, but through uncertainty. The wife responded similarly. She limited bank visits, communicated through secure channels only, reviewed access protocols repeatedly. She considered moving the contents of the safe deposit box, then dismissed the idea. Movement created records. Records created trails. Trails invited attention. The ceasefire was cracking, not because either of them had acted, but because external forces were now involved. Neither of them could fully see where the pressure was coming from. That made it worse. Secrets had developed momentum. They were no longer static risks contained within the marriage. They were active liabilities interacting with systems beyond their control. The husband began to imagine scenarios he had long suppressed. A verification request escalated unexpectedly. A compliance officer requesting in-person clarification. A historical audit triggered by unrelated restructuring. Each scenario ended the same way: exposure without warning. The wife imagined her own outcomes: an internal review prompted by routine policy updates, an employee connecting patterns over years, a request to consolidate records. Each scenario ended with questions she could not answer cleanly. They stopped sleeping well, not from fear, but from calculation. At night, they replayed conversations, reanalyzed interactions, measured timing. The silence between them became heavier, because now silence no longer meant safety. It meant ignorance. They began to sense that whatever was happening, it was moving independently of them. The system had begun to observe, not enough to act decisively, but enough to observe. Observation is the stage before action. Neither of them had planned for this phase. They had prepared for confrontation, for negotiation, for mutual threat. They had not prepared for passive attention, attention without accusation, attention without urgency, attention that quietly gathers information. The husband noticed colleagues behaving slightly differently, asking neutral questions, requesting confirmations that had never been required before. The wife noticed procedural language shifting, emails referencing updated policy frameworks, requests framed as standard compliance. Everything was still within normal bounds, but normal bounds were tightening. The cracks widened. A second document surfaced, this time referenced in an email thread the husband had not been a part of, a historical file included in correspondence between departments. He was copied inadvertently. He read the attachment carefully. It contained outdated information, early data, the kind that should have remained buried. Someone was reconstructing a timeline. At the bank, the wife received a second message. This one referenced enhanced verification procedures, a routine update, it claimed, affecting all clients. But the language included her safe deposit access category specifically. She understood immediately. She was no longer invisible. The ceasefire was failing from the outside in. Neither of them had broken it, but it was breaking anyway. Loss of control does not announce itself. It reveals itself through small failures, through things that no longer respond as expected, through systems that no longer behave passively. Their secrets had stopped waiting. They had begun to move. And once secrets begin to move, they do not return to stillness. The husband and wife continued their routines, spoke minimally, avoided confrontation, but the balance they relied on was dissolving because the danger was no longer contained within the marriage. It had entered the systems around them, and systems do not negotiate silence, they only proceed. The ceasefire had cracks now, and through those cracks, consequences were starting to show.
The house had grown quiet in a way that was heavier than silence. Not the deliberate quiet of careful strategy, not the neutral quiet that once allowed observation and calculation. This was a quiet that carried awareness, an undercurrent of change that neither of them could ignore. One of them decided it was time, not to speak, not to confront, not to negotiate, to act. The husband, after days of planning, had concluded that the only path to freedom required precision and timing. Every step was measured, every risk accounted for, or so he believed. He had watched the records, analyzed the systems, and traced paths through procedural frameworks. He thought he could manipulate outcomes without exposure, that he could relocate evidence, alter sequences, and secure his position without anyone noticing. The plan was careful, almost elegant in its design. He began with movement that appeared innocuous. Files transferred between folders, digital traces duplicated, verification steps preempted, every action recorded, but in ways that seemed routine. The illusion of normalcy was key. He believed that if everything looked ordinary, the systems would accept it, and he could emerge unscathed. The wife, as always, remained vigilant but unaware of the precise execution of this maneuver. She continued to monitor routines, bank accounts, and property access, assuming the patterns would continue as before. She trusted her control, the layers of documentation she had created, the complexity of access she maintained. She did not see the shift until it had already begun. It began with small anomalies, a digital access log updated in an unexpected sequence, a copy of a document in a folder that had not been opened for years. The timestamp suggested movement, yet no one had acknowledged it. Nothing had been reported, nothing queried. The husband interpreted this as a positive sign. He felt the thrill of perceived advantage. He believed that his careful handling meant he had outmaneuvered her, that he could reach the next phase where exposure could be contained and leverage could be regained entirely on his terms. He began the relocation of critical evidence, not to destroy it, not to erase it, that would invite attention. No, he duplicated, he moved, he created contingencies, multiple copies in multiple formats, digital and physical, stored in places he considered secure, layered in ways designed to prevent accidental discovery. He felt the satisfaction of control return, a temporary restoration of power. She noticed discrepancies, small but persistent, a file she had not opened, a reference she did not recall authorizing, minor shifts in digital footprints. She cataloged them internally, noting them carefully, but she did not yet have enough to confront or act. Patience remained her tool. Observation remained her weapon. The husband, confident, began to imagine the moment when the balance would tilt fully in his favor. He envisioned a scenario where the property could be transferred, where the divorce could be initiated, where his credentials, carefully maintained but fragile, could escape scrutiny. He calculated timing. He considered delays. He felt victory was within reach. And then, miscalculation. It was not her action that triggered exposure. It was an external factor entirely outside their control. The systems they had navigated, the institutions they had monitored, the bureaucracies they had avoided, one element, previously unnoticed, reacted. A scheduled internal audit, routine verification that had existed in parallel intersected with the paths he had created. a digital duplication triggered a reconciliation protocol. The files he had moved, the records he had copied, began to generate notifications in multiple places simultaneously. The first alert was minor, automated, procedural, harmless if unnoticed. It was noticed. The compliance officer reviewed the flagged records, not with suspicion, not with accusation, only with routine thoroughness. But the timing coincided with other small anomalies, other minor flags. In combination, the automated system escalated the matter. A report was created, documentation required, confirmation required. The husband realized immediately that control had slipped. The careful elegance of his plan had been interrupted by factors he could not predict. He tried to assess the damage. He attempted to contain exposure, duplicate more files, retract movements, adjust timestamps. But the system now operated beyond him. The automated protocols, combined with human oversight, had begun to compile a narrative he could not manage. The wife, noticing the subtle shift in data flows and notification patterns, began her own analysis. She did not know precisely what had happened, only that the system was engaging in ways that neither had instigated directly. She reviewed her records, cross-referenced timestamps, and realized with clarity that control had moved from individual hands to institutional structures. The equilibrium they had maintained was dissolving. Neither spoke, neither acted immediately. They observed, they recalculated. The property, the documents, the bank records, all were now intertwined with systems outside their control. Every attempt at intervention risked acceleration of exposure. Every pause increased the chance that automated processes or human oversight would produce irreversible disclosure. The husband felt a surge of urgency. Every second counted. The perceived advantage he had gained was evaporating. He had underestimated the persistence and independence of systems. The tools he had trusted to secure his freedom had become instruments of constraint. He was trapped not by her awareness, but by the procedural momentum of the institutions themselves. The wife realized the opportunity presented itself through observation. She did not need to act aggressively. She did not need to confront. The systems were revealing the full scope of their shared vulnerability. Evidence, once latent, was now active, and it was no longer dependent on human intention. The realization transformed the emotional landscape. Victory was no longer achievable by individual maneuvering. Survival depended on restraint, on understanding precisely the boundaries of what could be managed, on negotiating with systems rather than each other. They existed side by side, each aware of the shifting power, each calculating every next move in silence. They monitored notifications, messages, and procedures. Every interaction, every procedural email, every confirmation request carried new significance. Each could contain the information that would unravel their private histories. The illusion of control had vanished. The final gambit, the carefully executed maneuver intended to regain advantage, had backfired, not through confrontation, not through discovery by the other spouse, but through an independent force that neither could predict. The machinery of verification, reconciliation, and compliance had revealed the fragility of their secrets. At night, both lay awake in separate rooms, contemplating the collapse of what they had maintained for years. Every routine they had perfected was now vulnerable. Every layer of protection, every careful measure was under scrutiny without their intervention. They understood that exposure could occur at any moment, from any source. And they also understood something else. They could no longer depend on the other for containment. They could no longer depend solely on secrecy. The house that had once been their battlefield, their shelter, their negotiation table, had become a waiting room for inevitability. The final gambit, intended to secure one of them, instead activated forces neither had anticipated. Systems, protocols, and procedures were now the arbiters of fate. Evidence, once static, had become dynamic. Records had become dynamic. Access paths had multiplied.
Notifications previously dormant had begun generating chains of attention that neither could halt. The husband, despite every calculation, realized the plan had failed. The wife, despite her layered control, recognized that patience alone would no longer suffice. Both were caught in the culmination of their own decisions, in the culmination of their secrets, in the culmination of their shared history. The realization was simple and horrifying in its quietness. The exposure does not come from the spouse. It comes from the environment they have long navigated, quietly, precisely, systematically. It comes from the very systems they thought neutral. And the consequence of that revelation would not distinguish between guilt or innocence, cunning or caution. The final gambit was over. Control had shifted, and the silence that had once preserved them had become a space where truth, independent of intent, began to unfold.
When the final gambit collapsed, it did so quietly, with the subtle weight of inevitability rather than with noise or confrontation. There was no shouting, no arguments, no dramatic disclosures that could be replayed in hindsight as a single turning point. Instead, there was a slow and irreversible unspooling of everything they had constructed, a cascade of consequences moving at the speed of process and observation rather than emotion. The husband awoke one morning to a subtle yet undeniable shift. Notifications awaited him from institutions he had long considered dormant. Automated reviews had advanced further than he expected. Verification processes that had once been routine were now probing, requesting evidence, clarification, confirmation. Each click, each submission, each response triggered another automated cross-check, another review from a human agent trained to observe irregularities without needing to assign judgment. He had believed his forged credentials could withstand scrutiny with careful timing and procedural manipulation. He had believed that relocation of records and duplication of critical files would allow him to maintain control while moving toward resolution. That belief dissolved immediately. The systems were impartial. They operated on algorithms, procedural triggers, and accumulated records. They did not distinguish between intent or innocence. They only recognized irregularity and acted. His reputation, painstakingly built over years of careful maneuvering, began to erode silently. Notifications that should have remained neutral now carried implications. Employment records, financial submissions, institutional confirmations, all intersected in ways that revealed inconsistencies he had long concealed. Each query, each automated alert widened the exposure, and the realization hit him with a quiet but suffocating weight. There was no longer a path forward where he could preserve his previous standing. Across town, the wife faced her own unraveling. The vault she had maintained as a fortress of control, carefully cataloged, layered with security, supplemented by her own meticulous tracking of every record, was now compromised indirectly. Notifications arrived from oversight authorities she had assumed would never intersect with her sphere. System-generated requests referenced safe deposit boxes, prior transactions, and accounts linked to her indirectly. She had not moved the files, had not acted, yet the procedural web around her had shifted, pulling her records into scrutiny she could not fully anticipate. She recognized the pattern instantly. The control she had maintained over evidence, the careful leverage she had wielded to ensure compliance and restraint, was no longer sufficient. The systems did not require confrontation to expose the truth. They required only time, process, and accumulation, and with each processed item, her carefully cultivated protection eroded further. The marriage itself, once a negotiated silence, fractured completely. There was no ceremony of collapse, no confrontation, no declaration. Their interactions became formalities rather than engagements. They avoided shared spaces, not out of civility, but out of recognition that proximity could trigger observation or error. Their separate routines carried the same purpose, survival in a world now indifferent to the strategies they had developed. The property, once a frozen obstacle, advanced into relevance again. Its unresolved legal status, the inheritance structures, the conditional transfers, all activated as processes finally engaged. Documents that had been static for decades became active pathways of scrutiny. Requests arrived for confirmations, approvals were required, notices appeared demanding responses that neither could provide without exposing layers of carefully concealed history. The property, which had been the third presence in the marriage, now acted as a trigger rather than a barrier. It no longer waited, it initiated, it enforced. The couple's careers and personal freedoms suffered quietly but permanently. The husband faced institutional review at work. The systems responsible for verification traced discrepancies across documents, timelines, and submissions. The subtle inconsistencies, once obscured behind duplication and delay, were now visible through procedural intersections. Promotions halted, opportunities evaporated. He moved with caution, but the awareness of scrutiny constrained every decision. The freedom he had once taken for granted, the ability to maneuver professionally without exposure, was gone. The wife experienced similar consequences. Financial scrutiny intensified as oversight mechanisms followed procedural trails she had assumed were isolated. Routine audits intersected with her previously hidden accounts, forcing explanations she could not fully provide. The leverage she had maintained over information, the careful layering of evidence as a tool of survival, collapsed under the impartial force of systemic review. Each confirmation she submitted added new pathways for evaluation. Each digital trail intersected with another, and the quiet erosion of control began. Neither spouse gained the upper hand. The elaborate balance of the marriage, once maintained through silence, calculation, and mutual awareness, failed not because of confrontation, but because external systems moved independently. Neither could claim victory, yet both endured loss. The house, which had been a stage for their careful negotiation, became a space of quiet observation. Each movement carried consequence. Each interaction was filtered through the lens of procedural and institutional oversight. At night, they lay apart in separate rooms, contemplating the reality of exposure without confrontation. They did not speak of blame or fault. Words were unnecessary. The consequences were evident in every system-generated notification, every procedural request, every requirement for verification. They had constructed a marriage around leverage and silence. Those structures no longer protected them. They realized, finally, that the very elements they had used to maintain control, the forged credentials, the hidden accounts, the carefully managed documents, the property, had become instruments of their undoing. The marriage, once a tool of mutual containment, had dissolved quietly in evidence. And in that realization came the final lesson, stark and unyielding. Survival is not always contingent on cleverness or manipulation. Strategy is not always sufficient to contain history, systems, or consequences. Control is fragile. Silence may preserve, but only until external forces intersect with hidden truths. In the end, the narrator reflects, some marriages don't end in love or hate. They end in evidence. There was no victory, no triumph, only the slow, inescapable exposure of a life constructed on carefully hidden truths. Their freedom, carefully negotiated over years, was gone. Their reputations, meticulously curated, were damaged beyond repair. Their identities, both legally and socially, were compromised in ways that would be difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile. The house remained, the property remained, the documents remained, but the marriage itself, the fragile structure that had allowed coexistence, had dissolved quietly in consequences. No one emerged unscathed, neither could claim mastery over the other. Their leverage, once a weapon, had become a liability. The systems had acted with neutrality, impartiality, and inevitability, revealing the fragility of human designs when confronted with institutional momentum. And so, the marriage ended, not with a declaration, not with vengeance, not with reconciliation, but in evidence. Every record, every document, every notification stood as testament to the truth they had hidden, the decisions they had made, and the fragile equilibrium that had maintained their coexistence for so long. And as they moved forward separately, they carried the lessons of quiet collapse, that strategy alone cannot always preserve life, reputation, or freedom, that systems, procedures, and cumulative observation can act independently of intention, and that some endings are written not in confrontation, but in the slow, relentless unfolding of truth. Their story concluded not in resolution, but in acknowledgement. The marriage was gone, the secrets were revealed, and the evidence endured. It remained as a record, impartial and unyielding, marking the intersection of human ambition, calculated risk, and the impartial mechanisms of verification. Some marriages don't end in love. Some marriages don't end in hate. They end in evidence. And in